16. I like Ike. Who doesn't like Ike? He looks like everybody's granddad. Part 6. I'm hoping to bring this thing in for a landing with this video. Let's give it a shot, shall we? So we're going to receive a slide. We've already seen it before. It was on the last video, but I fell short just before we got to Cuba. So we talked about the U2 incident. Let's get to Cuba. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, really. There's a revolution going in Cuba. Okay, the president of Cuba is not a real nice guy. I don't know a lot about this situation because I don't do Cuban history, but he was not popular with some of the folks for various reasons, and so a revolt breaks out against him. The leader of this revolt is Fidel Castro. Okay, seen here. Or here, you prefer. All right. Now, Castro helps topple the government in Cuba. Okay. Now, there's just one problem. Now, remember, the U.S. has a long interest in Cuba because of our involvement there with the Spanish-American War. We have business interest in Cuba. People with, businesses have invested in, whatever, plantations probably. They grow a lot of tobacco there for cigars. Probably some resorts. It used to be a popular place to go for vacations. I don't really know what all was there, but this is what I do know. Castro, in addition to being a revolutionary, is also a communist. Okay, and he starts nationalizing these industries. Okay, people are losing their investments and stuff. And remember, Cuba is located just 90 miles south of Florida. Now, if you're a communist in the 1960s, guess who your friends are? That's right, the Soviet Union, because of course they always want to finance and encourage communist expansion. And so what the United States is faced with is the establishment of a communist country a mere 90 miles from our shore. Okay? And remember, we're working on this whole containment thing. Maybe we want to try to keep communism from spreading. And so there's worries about Castro. Now, it's not just that he's a communist. Maybe you could live with him being a communist, but he's also kind of a ruthless, brutal thug. Okay, this is kind of how communist regimes tend to work. Okay, if you're not on board with what they're doing, well, now you're a counter-revolutionary. Okay, and so now you're arrested and thrown in jail for thwarting the will of the revolution. Okay, the will of the people. Now, let me tell you, Castro seizes power in Cuba during the Eisenhower administration, and he stays in charge in Cuba for like 30 or 40 years. He only died a few years ago. Okay, so we're kind of back to where we are with the Korean situation. If the same person is in charge of a country for like 3 or 4 decades, it's probably not a really great place where you want to live. Okay? And of course, they still point everything out as we're a revolutionary government. If you're against us, you're somehow thwarting the revolution. I mean, after 40 years, you're really not the revolutionaries anymore. You're the power. Okay? But anyway, this is how things roll in Cuba. Okay? And so the Eisenhower administration, looking at the situation, says, well, maybe we need to start looking at maybe possible ways to get rid of Castro before he gets too ingrained and gets too set into power there. Maybe we start looking for ways to maybe take him out. So keep that in mind when we get to the next lecture about the problems with Cuba. So we're going to wrap up this I Like Ike thing with the 1960 elections, which has nothing to do with Eisenhower per se, but it's the end of the 1950s. Now, I mean, think about it. A decade goes 1, 2, you count. You don't count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. Okay, so 1960 is actually the end of the decade of the 50s. We tend to speak in popular culture the 50s, the 60s. It just rolls that way. But just remember that the 1960s is actually kind of like the big summing up of the 1950s. So it's election year. Gosh darn. Okay, every 4 years, like clockwork, around comes an election year. Okay? And there's always one in a year ending in 0. 1900, 1920. No, because there's not one in 1910. Forget that. Okay, I lied. But there's always one at the turn of the century, 1800, 1900, 2000. All right, let's go forward.